that became my mother's room for about close to 13 months. My mother of blessed memory stayed here. She couldn't get out of bed, and she ate and watched television and discussed and met with people and talked to the staff that was here assisting her. And I sit in this room and I remember. And one of the things that I remember is a student who came to the Lubavitcher Yeshiva in Kfar Chabad in 1966, in fall of 66. He came with a Hasidic Jew by the name of Mordechai Tachauer. And his name was and still is Reuven Clenson, also known as Rabbi Robert Clenson, of Congregation Children of Israel in Augusta, Georgia. I remembered my conversations with Robert in a talk in my Chabad house with a few people, how Robert had supposedly come to study Torah, but at the same time was secretly a Reform a student to become a Reform rabbi, and everything he was being taught at the yeshiva, he was going over with the Reform rabbi to get the rebuttals. And one of the discussions that we had was about the idea and concept of continuous creation. The Baal Shem Tov's Yortzeit, the day of his passing, is on Shavuos. And the Baal Shem Tov was the one who promoted a concept, or the concept, of continuous creation based upon a Medrash Tilik. But he was the one that promoted it and made it publicized and said that this is the simple meaning. For it says, forever God, your words are standing in the heavens. What does it mean, God, your words are standing in the heavens? Why does God's words have to stand anywhere? And the answer the Baal Shem Tov tells us is that the words of creation, the words to create the heavens, Yehi Rakia, those words are still there in the heavens, making them all the time. And if those words would be removed for a moment, God forbid, then the heavens, and not just the heavens, but all of creation, the words that we used to make them, they were removed for one moment, everything would cease to exist. And the proof he gave was that the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, says, everybody knows that when God caused the splitting of the sea, he did so with a strong east wind. And the east wind split the waters and held them into two walls. And the wind was causing the two walls to be held in an upright position. And if the wind were to cease for 1 second, the water would collapse, as it usually does. And if that's the case with something as unusual as the splitting of the sea, that the cause must be there continuously, then creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. God created something from nothing. That's a miracle. That cannot happen on its own. And from the first moment on, since it runs against nature altogether, it would collapse on its own if God were not holding it up continuously, just as the walls of water had to be held up continuously. And this is the argument for continuous creation, that when you have a change that's going against nature, you have to have a continuous support for that change. So Robert, in his style, he's a very good debater. In fact, he was a champion debater in college. So Robert argued, this is a limitation upon God. Why can't God create something to last? After all, if God can do anything, then God can cause something to last. The very fact that God needs to restore existence every moment is a limitation upon God. So therefore, Robert was actually arguing on behalf of Rambam, who does not agree with RESIDES that there was a continuous creation. Rambam says there was a creation for as long as God wants, and when that's over, it's over. So I wish to answer Robert. I wasn't able to answer him then, and he didn't want to listen to me then either. God can create anything. But there is no imperative for the existence to exist the next moment. And Bertrand Russell says this: just because something exists now is not a proof that it will continue to exist. There is no imperative for there to be an existence the next second. In fact, it has no basis for its own existence at the moment of creation. God causes it to be. So you say, well, then it's imperfect. It's an imperfect creation. And I ask you, can God create a rock that God can't pick up? That's the same kind of question. In order for something to exist on its own forever, it has to have been an original existence. Only the original existence can exist forever. Everything else, Robert, is arbitrary. It doesn't have to be there. God cannot make something that is not original to be original. God can only make it exist, and it exists as long as God wants. And that process, the question is that process a process of conscious thought, or is it unconscious? The difference is, does the world exist on its own, separate from God, and it has a pre-program that whenever God has put the limits on it, it will collapse? Or does God create at every moment, and it's a conscious thing that God is there in the world and is intervening in the world? And this is really a limitation on God. It's not a limitation on God, because God created the world to function completely as the world exists. This world theoretically can exist on its own as long as there's energy. And then there are other theories who say that the collapse of this existence will create a future existence, just a different kind. So the world is a perfect existence on its own. The world in its level, on its own level, is perfect and complete. But from God's perspective, God doesn't need it. And therefore, God has to want it to exist. So just because the world is a creation that can be taken back by God at any moment, because its existence is dependent upon God's will, does not make it an imperfect world. The world on its own level, in its own consciousness, its own behavior, its own nature, is completely perfect and completely self-existent. It's just that its existence comes from the will of God. And on God's level, the world doesn't have to be there and can stop at any moment. And that's what is meant by continuous creation. God wants us to be there. Hence we are there. God does not have to intervene. If he doesn't want us, we just stopped existing. Be well, Robert, alias Reuven.